Hello, everyone. Just get yourselves comfortable. We'll get proceedings started very, very soon, formally. Just make sure that you got yourself comfortable, got yourself a drink, or you're seated comfortably, got the sound right, and then we will begin. Hopefully, everybody is well and looking forward to the formal coming out of lockdown. Let's not speak too soon, obviously. There's plenty of time for them to cancel it. Right. Okay, everybody. Hello and welcome to this evening's online event. My name is Elvin Box, and I am privileged to be the chair of London Constructing Excellence. So we are delighted that you've been able to join us this evening for a talk that is very much a current and highly relevant constructing excellence subject matter, the Construction Playbook. The talk will commence in the next few minutes with your questions being answered from no later than 6:45 p.m. and our session wrapping at 7 p.m. Please note our hashtag tonight is hashtag LCECCP. And two quick key points to raise before we start the presentation. One, as you're aware, for presentation purposes, you will be muted. Please would you be kind enough to turn off your cameras as well. As is the norm for our online events, please use the chat facility throughout the presentation for your questions, which will be very, very gratefully received. If you wish people to know you are the author of a question, please ensure your name appears on the question. Thank you. Number two, please be aware that this evening's session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in the next 2 days. Now, before I introduce this evening's guest speaker, on behalf of the London Constructing Excellence Club, it's my very real pleasure to formally announce that David Churcher, who worked tirelessly and quite brilliantly for the London Constructing Excellence Club management team, was awarded the MBE in the recent Queen's Birthday Honours list. This magnificent honour was bestowed upon David for his dedicated voluntary work over the past 10 years to help develop standards and guidance around BIM and information management. Well done to you, David. London Constructing Excellence Club are immensely proud of you, sir, and absolutely delighted your dedication to BIM and information management has been recognised and, quite rightly, duly rewarded. Now, our guest speaker this evening is Alasdair Reisner, Chief Executive of the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. This association is a representative body for the UK's civil engineering contractors who build and maintain the nation's critical infrastructure networks in the key sectors of transport, energy, water, waste and communications. Alasdair has been its chief executive since 2014, and since March 2020, Alasdair has been working with the industry colleagues as part of the Construction Leadership Council COVID-19 Task Force. Tonight, Alasdair's presentation focuses on the Construction Playbook, which was published in 2020. The Construction Playbook promises to radically reform the way that the UK public sector develops and delivers construction projects nationwide, and in so doing, shake up some of the historic challenges faced by industry, including adversarial contracting methods, low productivity, supply chain difficulties. This presentation will review the priorities for such reform while also looking at how they are now being implemented across the country, including the delivery of Construction Playbook training. London Constructing Excellence are delighted to have such a knowledgeable specialist for your edification and entertainment this evening. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Alasdair Reisner.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Elvin. I'm going to say good evening, or I'm not sure it's good afternoon. It's that sort of period where it's neither one nor the other. I hope you can hear me well, and I hope you can see my slides. If for any reason either of those aren't the case, please do shout out. So first and foremost, a huge thank you to London Constructing Excellence Club. It's always brilliant to come and do stuff with you. I do quite a few presentations, meetings through the industry, and one of the big challenges I face is sometimes you're really trying to drag some questions out in the Q&A session. I know I will have no such problems at the end of this presentation this evening, both because the subject matter is hopefully interesting, but also because I know that from previous experience, you are certainly probing and you've got interests and you will ask questions at the end. So I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Elvin's given a bit of an overview of my background. As I say, normally when I'm doing things like these, I'm promoting the world of infrastructure and everything that my members are involved in delivering. But today I get to talk about none of that because I'm wearing a different hat today. I'm here sort of quasi under the auspices of the Construction Leadership Council, which I've been working with largely originally in relation to the response to COVID. And I think that's what I was talking about last time I was at the club. But today it's actually going to be looking at some of the work that we've been involved in relation to the playbook. So what I want to be very clear on in my presentation is that I've been a minuscule wheel in a huge machine that is the development of the playbook. I'm not the author of the playbook, so if you're looking for the person that was responsible for actually writing the document, I can't pretend that I am that person. However, hopefully, the work that we've been involved in as the Construction Leadership Council to try and articulate what the playbook means to industry means that I'm at least vaguely competent to answer some of the questions that you may have at the end. So the moment of truth, I've moved on my first slide. If it hasn't moved on, please again do shout out, but hopefully it has. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the playbook came about. I've got a bit of an embarrassing story about this. So some of you may be aware that there was something called the outsourcing playbook, now called the sourcing playbook, which really was in part a response to the Carillion failure and the fact that a lot of the sort of the services, facilities management type businesses at that time, the relationship wasn't very good between them and the public sector customers. So the outsourcing playbook was developed to try and sort of almost set the new rules of the game in terms of those relationships. So earlier this year, one of my members approached me and said, I gather that they're producing a construction playbook. Are you involved in it? And I went, oh, no, you don't need to worry about that. No such thing exists. I know that the CBI had written a report suggesting it should, but it's not happening. You don't need to worry about that. Mere days later, when I was approached by the Cabinet Office to say, we're producing a construction playbook, would you like to have some involvement in it? Obviously, that was slightly embarrassing for me to have to go back to the member and say that they had better insight as to what was going on in Whitehall and Westminster than I did as the person they were paying to do that job. So anyway, comes to June last year, the Prime Minister talks about project speed, and as the country comes out of COVID-19, that desire to build better, build faster, build greener. So the playbook formed part of that. The outsourcing playbook, now the sourcing playbook was seen as success. Well, why can't we produce a version of that that works for the construction industry? So it was in essence a document that's, as I say, sets the new rules for how projects are assessed, developed to the point of delivery, how you then go through the procurement to make sure you've got the right partners, the right suppliers to work on the project, and how it is delivered. And actually, I think almost how it is then used and the benefits of it are delivered for users. So it's a big part of this sort of project speed initiative, and therefore I think when one of the questions might be, well, is this really important? From my perspective, and I've got 20 odd years in the tank of looking at industry reports, this is one of the ones that does feel like it does have some traction across the industry, but more importantly has traction with government. So on the left of the screen, you have the outsourcing playbook. And on the right, you have the construction playbook. And what you have down the middle is these 14 key policies. So the ones in white are those that in essence have been dragged through from the outsourcing playbook, albeit they've then been given a sort of a construction spin. The ones in pinky purple are the ones that are brand new for the construction playbook. What I would say is there's very little that anyone who's sort of been involved in sort of industry reform, as I'm sure a lot of you at Constructing Excellence will have been, there's very little new here. All the ideas here are things that you will have seen before, but it's trying to encapsulate it into a single document, trying to make sure that all of the stuff that we talk about as good practice actually becomes real and does get implemented in the industry. So this slide just tries to capture what some of the key principles around that. While there are 14 priorities, I think if you boil it down to what almost an elevator pitch of what this is all about, this slide tries to deliver that. So that focus on outcome-based specifications, what do I actually want to achieve? Longer-term relationships across portfolios rather than tactical individual project by project. Standardization of design and components, and obviously with that there would need to be the interfaces, and that's obviously linked to the adoption of modern methods of construction, something that is not without controversy, and perhaps we'll explore that in the Q&A at the end. Creating sustainable, effective, win-win corporate contracting strategies. Like a big part of what this is, what has driven this, is some of the challenges that we saw across the construction industry in the last few years, the lack of sustainability in the supply chain, and what can we do, particularly at the time in industry that we probably didn't see that its recovery from COVID would be as rapid and positive as it has been, at least for parts of the industry. So, God, if we're starting with an unsustainable industry and then we're overlaying with COVID, what are we going to do to make sure that it does have a sustainable future? And yeah, the final point is around that project speed thing. How can we just make sure that the time it takes to get from the earliest inception to the actual beneficial use of projects is reduced? I think we need to recognise that all of this happens within an environment where there are policy pressures, particularly around building and workplace safety, around improving social value rather than just the lowest cost. And none of you, I'm sure, are not thinking about net zero at the moment and how within your own organisations that can be delivered. So that's, if there's one slide in this presentation that's important, I think this is probably it. This tries to encapsulate what it's all about in one slide. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and talk through some of the individual priorities in the playbook and talk about what they mean to us and what they're likely to mean to industry. So the first of those priorities is around commercial pipelines. I've been at SIAD now for 13 years. I suspect I've talked about pipelines more than anything else. That visibility, that clarity, continuity, consistency of knowing what's coming down the line in order that industry can invest against it. Because if you don't know what your next job looks like, you don't know what the scale of demand looks like as a material supplier, you don't know as a design organization where your next opportunity is going to come from, how can you do all of the rest of the good stuff that we're trying to encourage within industry? It's the big blocker if you're not able to do that. So that better understanding of demand allows to support the supply chain to better plan for its own future. Linked to that is market health and capability assessments. I think we're in a really interesting time at the moment, insofar as all of a sudden across the industry, you've got people crying out saying, I don't have the capacity to deliver because we've got issues about material supply. Whether that's plasterboard, whether that's concrete, there are a range of products that are just not available in the quantities that people are requiring them. At the same time, with Brexit and an aging workforce, suddenly skills, which has always been a problem, is becoming really acute. Can't get the people we need in order to deliver our projects. So right at the front, there needs to be that assessment about, can we assess the market that we're expecting to deliver our planned programs, our planned projects, and do they have that capability and capacity? And if they don't, actually, if we do that at the front end, we've got the opportunity to shape the market and get out there and actually help to ensure that we do have that market capability. So it's not just a case of saying, well, we found that there's not enough capability in the market, therefore we're just not going to do that project, not going to deliver that program. It's about saying, well, if we do find that, what can we do to furnish that supply chain going forward? Again, there's sort of a thread that flows through these. So the next then turns into portfolios and longer term contracting, which from the supply side of the industry, I think people have been crying out for years. Give us that long term plan, contract rather than tactically on an individual job by job basis, but across programs, and potentially even across portfolios where you're bringing together a range of similar works and starting to contract across a large number of them, because there's similarity, and therefore why would you artificially slice up that market? I think there are some challenges in there, because does that potentially lead to massive consolidation in the market? And does that therefore disadvantage SMEs? But generally speaking, for a market, that ability to improve because you're doing continual work, similar work, that across a series of projects that drives continuous improvement, just seems like something that as an industry we've been crying out for. The next element of this is in relation to harmonizing, digitizing and rationalizing demand. So this is this idea of almost the kit of parts of, can we start to move to a more platform approach of, if we're doing the same thing over and over again, why are we producing bespoke designs for that? Why are we not starting to draw on the capabilities that digital technologies allow us, that manufacturing supply chain intelligence provides us with, to start having much greater consistency, while at the same time still producing beautiful structures, beautiful assets? There's nothing within this that says we're going to produce noddy boxes because that's all we've got the capability to produce. It's about what can we do to harness consistency where it's appropriate while still having design flair as part of the offer. And looking at that, so clearly in the last decade we've been on a journey in relation to BIM. I don't think anyone's arguing we should go backwards on that, but using the BIM framework to standardize the generation classification of data feels like the next step along the road. Move towards information management framework, so it's not just better data within the project, but actually looking across a range of projects. And I'm sure elsewhere on similar presentations, you've had discussions about the National Digital Twin and that idea of sort of the digital twin of the built assets, to have a better understanding how systems are operating, how individual buildings, how individual infrastructure systems are operating, just feels like a huge win. But it takes a lot of work to put in place the underlying infrastructure that makes that happen. Now, I said that pipelines were probably the thing I've spent most of my time since I joined the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. The other thing that we've been strong advocates for long before I ever joined was early supply chain involvement. If you want to build something, why would you not involve those people who are likely to build it when you're developing it? And when I say the people that are going to be building it, that's not just the contractors. You'll not find anyone who's not a stronger advocate for contractors than me. But there's more than just contractors involved in the supply chain. It's those people that can bring value to help make decisions early on within the development of the business case of projects that produce huge savings, but more importantly, produce huge value further down the line in terms of the way that projects are delivered. And when I talk about value, we move to the discussion about the outcome-based approach, focusing on what you actually want that investment to achieve, rather than just saying, here's the scope of what we're going to deliver. So starting to move into a world where we don't just measure the lowest cost, but we measure, has it achieved the outcomes that we actually wanted when we set out? Or if it hasn't, can we explain why those outcomes have shifted? And project scorecards give us the ability to move the dial on that. I think we'll see some more stuff in that space relatively soon. Clearly, when you look at some of the discussions that are happening within a lot of public bodies, this move to outcome-based approaches seems to be accelerating quite quickly. Benchmarking and should cost models. I think we have seen across industry challenges where there's not been enough data at the front end when project business cases are being developed. And so people have been surprised when the outcomes at the end have not been what they anticipated, because they've basically had poor quality benchmarking data at the front. So this aims to try and encourage a culture of benchmarking across public sector works, using should cost modelling to understand not just what it's going to cost me to build the asset, but what the whole life cost and value of that asset is going to be. So next is around the delivery model assessment. So this is not expecting that the way that you're going to use a delivery model is going to be the same regardless of what it is you're delivering, what kind of organization it is doing the delivery. So it's actually starting to draw intelligently on evidence to say, well, what kind of client organization am I? What kind of supply chain am I working with? What is the nature of my requirement? And I want to say mechanizing or using an evidence-based approach to say, well, if I'm that and my supply chain's that, and this is what I'm going to deliver, and other metrics that we can pull on, what's going to be the evidence-based approach built on the basis of experience as the best delivery model to help me achieve the outcomes that I'm wanting to achieve. And again, this is something that we feel that we're seeing quite rapid movement forward, seeing things like the value toolkit being developed by the Construction Innovation Hub that supports things like this. So once we've got that delivery model, it's about how we then contract with the supply chain. So again, those of you who've been around the block a few times, none of this is going to feel like radical, far out stuff. This is stuff that we've been talking about for years, but looking at contracts that promote collaboration, very easy to talk about, but perhaps more difficult to achieve. Contracts that approach that allow data sharing, that secure better risk management, something we'll come back to, and value improvement. So getting that contracting relationship much better is now a fundamental part of what the Construction Playbook expects from public sector clients. Now, linked within this, and it almost as a standalone piece of work, is the current approach to construction frameworks. You may be aware that Professor David Mosey is currently undertaking a review of construction frameworks. Everyone on this call will have a view on the use of frameworks. I think where they are used effectively, they're a hugely beneficial approach that unlocks a lot of the things that I've been talking about in this presentation. However, I'm sure that all of you have also seen poor frameworks, zero value frameworks that actually genuinely deliver zero value, frameworks where every single opportunity is mini competition to death, and used just to screw down not just the framework contractor, but their supply chain as well. So making sure that we get a much more effective approach to construction frameworks feels like a real area of opportunity to help unlock some of these benefits. So risk allocation. So this is understanding who's best to understand to manage the risk. Again, it's not radical stuff that we've been talking about for years, but putting in place models where that is baked into the model. We need to engender this as just the culture of the industry as a whole, and part of that is around transparent communication around that allocation, because let's be honest, this is where projects go wrong, where risk sits with an organization that isn't well placed to manage it, and therefore when that risk materializes, all hell breaks loose across the project, and it leads to delay, it leads to cost escalation. I'm not saying it's the only reason why projects go wrong, but it's one of the driving risks that we see when we look across some of the projects that we have seen that failed across industry. Can't have an industry report without talking about payment, but this isn't just talking about the fact that you should pay your supply chain, although of course, absolutely, that's got to be at the heart of everything to make sure that payment flows rapidly through the supply chain, but also about what is that payment mechanism, and are people actually getting paid for stuff that they shouldn't be paid for? You know, are people just in essence filling seats? Are people in essence creaming off where they're not adding value? So we want to move away from that. So actually, there's a much stronger link between the outputs that people are delivering, the value they're creating, their performance against wider policy objectives, and the return that they receive as a result of that. And a fundamental part of that is going back to the early involvement of the supply chain. Let's test that with the suppliers, because if you go out with a payment mechanism that turns off the supply chain, it's another reason why you may not get the suppliers, you may not get the relationships that you want as part of the delivery of the projects that you're involved in. So the final two, to an extent, is about looking back at that Carillion issue, and it's not just Carillion. You know, when we look back through our membership, there have been a number of significant failures within organisations, but below that, actually in the supply chain, we see significant failures as well. So part of the construction playbook talks about making sure that you've done checks on the financial capacity of the suppliers that you work with, because what you don't want is that to materialise when you are midway through a project or program, but also making sure that that's transparent, objective, and non-discriminatory. Because I think some of the pushback from industry is, you know, there can be times when people are perfectly capable of delivering, but almost you've got a computer says no approach to, well, you didn't pass a particular financial threshold, and therefore we can't let you bid for this job that we actually know you'd be perfectly capable of delivering. And the worst case of that relates to, well, what happens if a major supplier or indeed any supplier fails? Have you got resolution planning in place to make sure the risks to the program or the project are managed or understood and managed in the event that a supplier does fail? So it's about working with suppliers as well to understand and develop mitigations to that risk. So in a relatively short period of time, that is a canter through some of the playbook priorities. But I did say there are some things that sort of wrap around this as well. And I'm glad that given everything else that's going on in the space, the government didn't lose sight of health, safety and well-being being a huge priority as part of this. So they're very clear that none of this is a success if it comes at the price of a reduced focus on health, safety and well-being of the workforce and the people that we work around. A similar but different area is around building safety. I don't think anyone needs a reminder of why this is important, but the playbook is clear about setting the behaviours and practices throughout the whole of the delivery chain for construction and handoffs to ensure that the buildings, and not just the buildings and structures and infrastructure that we create is safe for that end user and those that come into contact with it. I've talked about delivering net zero by 2050, and those of you who work for public sector organisations will already be seeing significant moves from all of them around moving towards net zero, in many cases far quicker than 2050. But again, you almost have the thing about walking at the pace of the slowest man, and by putting this into the playbook, it makes sure that this is part of the rule book, the playbook for construction in the public sector. So everyone has to have plans around this, even if they hadn't had plans as a result of the proliferation of other policy in this space. And finally, social value. In essence, making sure that we're not just delivering assets, we're delivering for the communities in and around, and the wider communities associated with the things that we build. So those are the cross-cutting priorities that are sort of the go through everything that I've talked about today. But we've probably not answered the most fundamental question, which is, well, that's all well and good, but is this just another report that sits on a shelf? So on the next slide, I'm going to try and articulate why I think that it isn't. So first and foremost, who does the playbook apply to? So it is all public works and programs undertaken by central government departments and their arm's length bodies. So that, you know, everyone that's directly funded by a central government department, so your Highways England's, your Network Rails in my world, but Homes England, people like that, are all within scope for this. Now that comply or explain means exactly that. Either you follow the rules or you better have a bloody good reason why you're not. It's not explain, oh, I just didn't fancy it. It's you're going to have to be able to explain the practical, pragmatic reason why you didn't adopt an element of the playbook. And we would expect that there'll be some monitoring of that as to where that is happening. Now, that doesn't apply to the same extent to the wider public sector. So your local authorities, your local bodies, and those that are sort of slightly beyond the reach or beyond the direct funding of central government, where they have a expectation that they will take the playbook into account. I think the emphasis here is on the fact that if the playbook is perceived to be a good practice document for the industry, it starts to become a question of, well, why wouldn't you adopt this. So that, for me, explains where the client side of the industry sits in relation to this. However, and I say this as a representative of the supplier organization, we shouldn't expect our clients to have to do all the work while we have our feet on the desk going, can you improve my life for me? There is a huge expectation also around industry. And so for my final slide, I'm just going to run through what we see as the role for industry. So the first is one around governance. It's about promoting this, getting out there and saying, if we believe in this stuff, let's go out there and build it into our industry on the supply side as well. And so one of the roles for the Construction Leadership Council has been to go out there and put in place training, put in place support. So some of you may have taken part in some of the dedicated webinars that we're running on individual priorities within the playbook, and those are continuing, and I'm in the process of preparing e-learning modules that should be available via the CLC and the Supply Chain Sustainability School, so that you can help inoculate this within your own businesses. From an organizational point of view, it's about making sure that your policies within your organization reflect the playbook and flow them down. It won't be possible to 100% back-to-back everything because some of it doesn't apply down the supply chain, but where it's possible, try and reflect this down your supply chain. And review the pipelines that are coming up. So there's no point in asking for pipelines and then doing nothing with them. I think there's a big expectation that the industry will look at those pipelines and derive value from the availability of that information. It's not really on here, but I think there's also the making sure that you're providing pipelines out to your supply chain, because just saying, well, we want that data, but then we're going to hold it closely doesn't feel like the right answer. It should be a flow throughout the supply chain of, well, if this is our expectation of what's coming in my client's pipeline, this is what the articulation of that will mean downstream from me into the lower tiers of the supply chain. So I think adopting value-based procurement, again, not just expecting your client to do that, but doing that down through your supply chain and including social value within the way that you procure your own supply chain. So we've talked about net zero and manufacturing-led solutions and health and safety. Again, it's about making sure that these are boiled into what you do. Picking up meeting the standards of UK BIM framework. Again, it feels like this is something that a lot of businesses are doing because they're being driven by clients in any case. But this is one of the asks of industry. This is what we're looking for. Adopting digital processes around payment. Again, we're on a journey here. It feels like that's going to be one of the areas that unlocks a huge amount of benefit, but may have some challenges associated with it. And again, around quality of the planning processes within your organization, so that you are looking at quality throughout the way that you deliver. There's quite a lot on this slide, so it may be better that, because I am mindful I do want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. But yeah, it is about making sure that within every organization, you're not just expecting the playbook to be something that is done to you by your clients, but is something that you have an active role, if you're a supplier, in building on what your clients are doing, working with them to adopt and sort of implement the playbook recommendations within your own organization and encouraging it down your supply chain. So that is a quick canter through the playbook. Actually, looking at the clock, I think I was probably running ahead of myself there a little bit. In terms of what we're doing now, as I mentioned, we are producing training on each of these priorities within the playbook, and there's a whole lot of other work going on across industry. Often people say to me, that's great, but there's no opportunity for me to get involved. The one thing I would say is I've not seen anything from the Cabinet Office, from Treasury, from Infrastructure and Projects Authority, from Construction Leadership Council, where people have said we don't want people involved. This is going to be success where people know about it and where they feel they've had an opportunity to have their views, to have their say. So at that point, I'm going to shut up momentarily because I do want to hear from you as to what your views are on what I've said, any feedback that you've had, but also any challenge, because I think, if we've got some of this wrong, let's have that conversation. So Elvin, I'm going to hand back to you. I don't know, because I can't see on my screen whether there are any questions. I can't even tell whether I've been talking into the void for the last half hour. But I'll pass back to you, and hopefully that's not been the case.
You're fine, Alasdair. You're absolutely fine. It would appear everybody heard you loud and clear, and saw the wonderful slides loud and clear. We've got some, as always, some good questions coming in. You just wait there. I'll sing out the questions, and then you can have a think and say what your thoughts, feelings, observations are on the answers.
Yeah.
First one I want is Vic Mosca. Thank you, Vic. How do project bank accounts feature in the Construction Playbook report?
So it's an interesting question. I think there's been some misreporting around this, that in essence, either the project bank accounts are not sort of supported by the Construction Playbook, or that there's been sort of lobbying against them. I want to be very clear. Project bank accounts are government policy. And so while the playbook doesn't necessarily sort of have a line that says you absolutely must use project bank accounts on every occasion, it is because it is a reflection of existing government policy. I believe there is, sorry, I haven't got a copy of the playbook in front of me. I do believe there is some mention of project bank accounts within there. I think the policy specifically is similar to comply or explain, that in essence, within certain parameters, public sector clients in the government departments and arm's length bodies are expected to use them. Where they don't have a good reason not to. I will apologise, as I say, I'm not the author of the document, so I don't have that in front of me, but I believe there is some mention of it in the document, but there's not more mention of it, because almost all you'd be doing is repeating the existing government policy in this space.
Good question, good answer. Thank you very much, Alasdair. Very good of you. Sandy Mackay has said, this is just the next version of ideas that have been around since Latham, etc. Why do we think this will actually deliver change this time? What is different about this approach?
Okay, so this is probably my favourite question. I haven't heard the other questions yet, because I think it's a really fair question. I joined the industry in 2000. So I've seen a few reports, and I used to be a journalist. So I used to work for Construction News before I do what I do now. So I've been quite scathing about some of those reports, particularly where there has been a monumental failure to deliver on the objectives of those reports. So that's a bit strange for me to now be so positive about the playbook. So I'm going to try and explain why I'm much more positive about the playbook than I have been about any report in the industry, up to and including Latham and Egan. And it's because of the link back to this comply or explain. This is not suggestions. This is a pretty much you will. But above and beyond that, we've got a procurement bill coming up, going through Parliament later this year. And I don't know, I'm speculating here, but I feel that that bill will probably strengthen what is currently an expectation in the wider public sector. And who knows, there may be something that tries to even further, mandate's too strong a word, but really push for some of the stuff that's in the playbook to be implemented fully across the industry. So I do, I may yet be proved wrong, and I'm more than happy to come on here in a couple of years' time and have you all throw tomatoes at me if I've got it wrong. But genuinely, in my 20 years in the industry, this for me feels like the most likely to deliver change.
Okay, mate. So fair answer. Fair answer. Well done, Alasdair. Now, Keith Maynard. Well done, Keith. So he says, so we have a new document not to put on the shelf, but one, what is the intended lifespan? Two, if and when updated. Three, what is the next document to come along? Would you agree that Construction Playbook sits with the historic Latham bill and so on? So it's quite an intricate question, but have I explained that okay for you, Alasdair?
Yes, and it feels like it's almost a link to the previous question. I don't think anyone has said, this document has a best before date of 2025 or 2030 or anything like that. I think that inevitably it will end up on people's shelves because it's an important document, but I hope it's not one that only sits on the shelves. I'm hoping it's one that people take down from the shelves, or probably in a low carbon world, ones and zeros on their computer rather than wasting paper printing it out. So in terms of what will replace it, I think there's a good exemplar here because we do have the sourcing playbook, which is what this was drawn from, and it has had iterations. So instead of going out and creating a new document because industry likes a shiny new toy every 5 years, I think it's about, if needs be, updating the existing document, but holding it as these continue to be the rules of the game, because we know as an industry that if we do just keep jumping from document to document, nothing gets done.
Yeah, I should say so. Yeah, very true. Okay, now, moving on, because Rob, thank you, Rob Garvey. Good question, this. Alasdair, really clear presentation, which is always a good start, and all very logical. Brilliant. Now, much of this is still predicated on the client side, setting the project in line with the guidelines. My question, can the supply chain have faith that change is actually going to happen? It's a fair question, Alasdair.
It is a fair question. And I think it's probably, if you had the risk register for this, it's going to be one of your higher risks that everyone's going to go, well, that's great, but we're not doing it. Clearly, the complier explain makes it much more difficult to do the not invented here, so we're just going to ignore it. But I think all of us have experience of working in industry, and even the stronger, I've seen stuff that's literally the law that client organizations have ignored because it wasn't convenient for them to do it. So we can't be so naive as to suggest that this absolutely will happen. I think one of the other things, along with that, the fact that there is this comply and explain requirement, and the fact that there will be, I think, some government side monitoring of this, is that you've now got the Construction Leadership Council, which, and I've probably banged on about this at the previous time I presented, but that's the industry working together collectively so much better than it ever did. And one of the requirements on industry, I talked about the training requirement, but one of the others is to report back where we don't see the playbook being implemented. And we've already done that. There's been cases where stuff has gone to market and we've gone straight back and said, well, this doesn't feel very playbook. Now, I think where stuff comes to the market 1-2 months after the playbook's published, you can probably say, hey, there's probably a communications job for people to get this information out to those organizations. It was probably naivety that they didn't even understand the playbook existed. I think that excuse goes away. So there's a big responsibility on industry to actually, if people aren't delivering to the playbook and they are in that complier explain space, let's let people know. Let's actually, live our values, because if we believe that this stuff is important, let's make sure that it does not sit dusty on a shelf. Let's give it life by reporting the cases where it's not happening and making sure that it does make a difference.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm agree with that. Thank you, Alasdair. We've got a great question as always. Stuart Green, thanks for joining us, Stuart. Stuart has asked, the Construction Leadership Council has clearly supported the importance of incentivizing direct employment. Why is this so starkly ignored in the playbook? Surely this is key to resolving the skills crisis and ensuring improved social value. Good question. I think you'd agree there, Alasdair.
It is a good question, and it's a challenging one because I've got a really good answer to that, but unfortunately it requires me breaching confidences, so I can't. However, I would be very clear that while there may not be a huge amount about direct employment in the document, I'm very confident that it is not being ignored. You are quite right to point out the CLC has made some very clear commitments about this, but I think that is reflected by the government side and the desire to drive direct employment through public sector works. It's very disappointing that unfortunately all I can say is watch this space. But it's not a watch this space on the basis of I just want to avoid a difficult question. It's a watch this space on I think something's happening fairly shortly, but it's not my story to tell. So I'm going to leave that to others.
I hope that's all right for you, Stuart. I think it's a great question. That's an extraordinarily diplomatic answer, Alasdair. But I think what the answer is, please do watch this space. Great question, and it's not being ignored by the Construction Leadership Council or the industry. That be fair to say, Alasdair?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, I should also preface some of this by saying we're doing a load of work on the Construction Playbook. We're also involved in something called the Construction Leadership Council Skills Plan, which is where some of this stuff around direct employment has stemmed from. And I know, because I've been engaging with some of the people who are involved, there's good work going on right now in relation to starting to get some of this stuff baked into contracts, starting to encourage direct employment down the supply chain. So it's a pretty busy space at the minute. As I say, it's just the challenge is some of that stuff, in order for it to have impact, you don't necessarily want it to drip out. You want to make sure that it's announced properly. And because it's not necessarily my story to tell, I'm just being a little bit circumspect about stealing other people's thunder.
Well done, sir. No, and I'm with Stuart on that. It's a great question, and let's hope, fingers crossed, it does actually flow as you're just suggesting there, Alasdair.
Yeah.
Paul Greenwood, thank you, Paul. Building on Rob's question, which is Rob Garvey, who within government is actually going to enforce the comply or explain mandate? Is that clear for you there, Alasdair?
It is. And rather embarrassingly, I should know the answer to this question. And I'm not sure that I do, but I don't think that's as a result of there not being an answer to the question. It's just I believe it'll sit with Infrastructure and Projects Authority. And the reason I'm sort of being hesitant is I have been told this, and it's one of those things where the last year has been fairly busy, and I can't remember specifically how that function operates, but it's not that it's not there. I would also say that when we look at the procurement bill or the procurement green paper that we had earlier on in the year, it talks about a sort of central procurement oversight function that it will come as a result of that procurement bill. And I don't want to link the two, but it feels like there's a bit of a sweet spot there. But as I say, rather than give the wrong answer, I'd rather actually come back to you offline and confirm specifically how that functions.
That would be brilliant if you could, Alasdair.
Yeah.
That would be really, really brilliant. And Paul and myself and the others would happily put it across social media and to people, because that's a great question and it's a great way of art. That'd be brilliant if you could come back to us. That'd be brilliant, Alasdair. Now, old friend Richard Saxon, thank you so much, Richard. The playbook emphasizes long-term relationships with suppliers. Is this the end of procurement from square one every time? Some will see this as closing the door on less established suppliers, yep, as the big boys become even more established. I'm actually in favour of that, as was Egan. Could you comment, please, Alison? Well played, Richard. It's a fair comment. In agreement, disagree? Just thoughts, feelings, observations on that, Alasdair.
Well, I think I vaguely touched upon this in my presentation insofar as I think that there is a potential to get market consolidation as a result of some of this stuff. And like you, Richard, it's great to see you, Richard. It is something that, generally speaking, I think should be supportive to get longer term capability and the benefits that flow from that. I think it's about understanding what the role for small organizations, nimble, flexible, small organizations that can deliver innovation and outstanding value within that context is. What I don't want to see is a bunch of monolithic organizations that suddenly have no competition, so have no reason to reform and no reason to drive value. I want it to be, this is going to sound like corporate nonsense, but a exciting and flexible ecosystem of suppliers that deliver outstanding results for the customer. I'm kind of ambivalent about how that all fits together and the size of the relative size of the organizations within it. It's much more important to me that the system works well, than necessarily we get to sort of a French or Spanish style model where you've got a number of very, very large organizations that are sort of vertically and horizontally integrated.
Yeah, yeah, a good example of that. Good question, good answer. Well done, Alasdair. Another one from Paul. Well done, Paul. Paul Greenwood. The construction playbook is implemented by a raft of conventional, commercial, procedural, procurement notices, etc. Now, when will these be updated to cut through the middle management permafrost that impedes the implementation of so many initiatives? Did I explain it clear enough, Alasdair?
I think so, but I mean, the answer is it already has been. You know, there is a procurement notice specifically related to this. So that expectation is already there. As I say, I think from a fairness point of view, you do have to give, particularly in the wider public sector, organisations some time to understand that it exists. But you know, the policy is this is policy. This is not speculative. It's already there.
There you go. That's fair enough. It's already there. So hopefully, Paul, that's your answer. It's already there. Another one from the great Rob Garvey. What one thing this is would you advise tier one contractors to do to ensure they deliver to this playbook? That's a fair question there, Alasdair. What one thing would you advise tier one contractors to ensure they deliver this playbook?
Well, fortunately, the answer to that is the same as the answer to all of the other suppliers in the industry. And it's to get a hold of the document, have a look at it, understand what it means to your clients and potential future clients, and understand your organizational alignment to it. I think you've also got to be sensible. While I'm here proselytizing about how great the playbook is, you've got to take a commercial decision on this and work out for yourself whether, in essence, you're also willing to drink the Kool-Aid. That's probably not the quote for social media there, but whether you genuinely believe this or not. But if you do think that this is part of our industry's future, I think it's about ensuring that you do have alignment with it, because if clients are buying on the basis of the playbook, they will be buying on the basis of suppliers that are aligned to it.
Fair comment. Fair comment. Yep. Yeah. Because the assumption is then, Alasdair, is that this is government contracts, but this is actually government saying, now there's an expectation, everybody, is that commercial clients, everybody who procures in UK and under the government that we have now, this is how we expect people to procure construction. Is that correct?
So I want to be very clear on
Yeah.
this. No. There is the central government where there is the comply or explain requirement. There is the wider public sector where there is an expectation that you'll take into account. The private sector,
Yeah.
it's up to them. You know, there is nothing within this that tells the private sector what it must do or it should do. However, again, you go back to the point of, if this is good practice, why wouldn't you want to do this? This is a rule book for those that have to follow the rules, but it's also a playbook for those that just want to know what good looks like. So if I'm a private sector organization, first and foremost, I'd say many private sector organizations are already doing lots of this stuff because they're answerable to shareholders, and their shareholders have already said, you know, this just makes sense. You know, you look in some of our more enlightened infrastructure clients in the private sector, they've been doing this stuff for 10 years because just it makes sense for them to do it. But yeah, for the other private sector organizations, I would say this is more a manual of what they could be doing well, rather than there's any legal requirement for them to do so.
Excellent. Okay, that's fair answer, Alice. Fair answer. Talking to fair answers, Rob Garvey, it's up with the questions tonight. Rob, do you have what's your view on the competency of the industry to deliver upon the playbook? And I would say that currently.
I think part of the answer to that is that we've been asked to produce support for industry to help build certainly competence is a much bigger conversation, but first step on the road is to actually understand what some of this stuff's about, and then you go down into the layer of, can we demonstrate competence against this? On the one hand, because some of this stuff just feels like stuff we've been talking about for a long time, it feels like it's not asking the world for industry to be able to get towards some of this stuff. That said, from a cultural and behavioral point of view, again, everyone on this call will know that how their organization, how the organizations they work with operate, and a lot of that is quite deep seated in terms of the change that's going to need to happen. But I tell you what, it's going to be easier for that change to happen if everyone's trying to go in the same direction,
Yes.
as opposed to, we want you to change your culture, and then you go and work for someone else, and they also want you to change your culture, but in an entirely different way to the way the previous organization did. So again, it's trying to create that consistency around what good looks like, so to give people a fighting chance of moving towards something that's going to be beneficial for everyone.
Good answer. Well done, sir. Well done, sir. So one quick question, because time's run out, sadly. Well done, Alice. A great start. Actually, the time's gone really quick. A stupid daft question, but you mentioned there quickly about innovation and modern methods of construction. Are we seeing currently sufficient progress, or do we now need to boost it again? Is the industry taking up by the cudgels? Yes, we're going to be more innovative, and we are using modern methods of construction, or do we need another boost?
So the difficulty with the question is differing people in industry will have differing views of A, how far down the journey we are, and
Right.
B, how far down the journey we need to go. I was once upbraided in a room full of my peers for saying we weren't moving quickly enough on
Right.
innovation rather than modern methods of construction, by
Yeah.
people who are saying we're doing brilliant stuff and you just don't know about it. At the same time, we've been really challenged on some of this to say, you think that modern methods of construction are the solution to all of life's ills. Actually, there's a whole load of other stuff out there that needs to happen. So I'm just going to give you my personal perspective, and that is to say, I think we're seeing pockets of outstanding practice
Yeah.
generally across the industry. I would say we're nowhere near where we could be. And when we look at other industries, and I know that everyone goes to the car industry, but when you look at the International Vehicle Manufacturing Program, that's 30, 40 years ago
Yeah.
now.
Yes.
And yet the change in that is kind of within our grasp by collaborative effort across an
Yeah.
industry. And it's not about modern methods of construction. And I get a bit frustrated that people go, oh, well, we'll just prefab everything. It's much richer than that. And it's digitalization and everything like that. And that feels what's in our grasp. But it's also really, really tricky. And there's just no getting away from that because it requires everyone to move in the same direction en masse. And even a small number of people saying, well, we're not going to go there, potentially undermines the whole thing.
Yeah. Those are great questions and good answers. I've got to say, Alice, you've been brilliant. Thank you so much for everything. Just hold there for a moment while we wrap things. If you just hold for a second. And can I thank everybody for your questions? They were wonderful and lovely that you've been actively participating participating, I should say. Now, just two particularly important notices before we close the proceedings, good people. One, our next event is Tuesday, 10th of August, starting at 6 p.m. And our guest speaker will be Simon Wyatt, who leads the Net Zero Carbon and Sustainable Governance teams at global engineering consultancy Cundall. Simon shall be telling us all about why developers need a clear net zero carbon strategy. Two, please would you be willing to respond to Anna Kelly's email on feedback from this evening's event? We'll be with you in the next 24 hours. We do everything we can to use your comments to continually improve our product and service to meet your needs. We will be immensely grateful if you would provide this feedback for us. Many thanks in advance. So to round up, huge and incredibly grateful thanks to the hard-working London Constructing Excellence Management team, the largesse and technical wizardry of the team at SIAD, who co-produced this evening's event, plus your very good selves, everyone, for participating, I can't say that damn word, participating this evening. And many, many thanks once again to our wonderful guest speaker, Alasdair Reisner. Alasdair, did you enjoy yourself, sir?
Always enjoy myself when I do these things, so very happy to come back whenever I've got something else interesting to say. I hope it was interesting.
It was brilliant, mate, and we'll have you back, sir, anytime. So everybody, the hour at 7 o'clock. Good night, everyone. Look forward to interacting with you all again in 4 weeks' time. And thank you once again, Alasdair. Thank you, everybody.